Okay, can we start? Excellent, excellent. So, good afternoon, good morning. My name is Joel Tenyedi. I am a political scientist working at Central European University. Welcome to the panel discussion that is entitled Leftist Illiberalism, Latin American and European Perspectives. Illiberalism, the central concept of this panel, is often assumed to be a characteristic of the radical right. But in reality, liberal democratic norms can be challenged from multiple directions, including the left. Some of the most prominent themes in contemporary illiberal discourse, such as cultural homogeneity or the defense of traditional values, are indeed more at home on the right. Yet, there exist actors with leftist identification who embrace these values. And more fundamentally, it seems to be entirely possible to combine left-wing economic or social preferences with a total rejection of individual freedoms and political pluralism. In the Horizon-funded project entitled Neo-Authoritarianisms in Europe and the Liberal Democratic Response, or AUTHLIB for short, we have adopted broad conceptualization of liberalism that encompasses both left-wing and right-wing variants. But because our research primarily focused on political parties in 7 European countries, and because most of the illiberal actors in our sample turned out to be right-wing, our findings have tended to reinforce the prevailing stereotypes. That's why I'm especially pleased to have the opportunity to speak today with experts who bring insights from the other side of the coin. So I would like to welcome Laura Gamboa, who is Assistant Professor of Democracy and Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame, Armando Chaguaceda, who is Professor at El Colegio de Veracruz and Research Coordinator at the Institute for Government and Political Analysis, GAPAC. And finally, Esther Kovacs, who is Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Vienna. They will all give short presentations, and then we open the floor for discussion. Online participants may pose questions during and after the talks using the Q&A function of Zoom. I would like to remind you that the event is recorded and it will be made available online, both on the YouTube of the German Marshall Fund and the YouTube channel of AUTHLIB Horizon Project, who are the co-hosts of today's event. So without further ado, let me turn to Laura Gamboa and ask her to speak about the causes of the famous pink tide, the victory of leftist actors in Latin America at the beginning of the 21st century, about what has happened since then, about the differences between liberal democratic and illiberal leftist actors, and about the tensions between social justice on one hand and democracy on the other hand. Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much all for the invitation and everybody else for being here. My presentation is going to be like a broad introduction. Let me share my screen and hope that this actually works out. Can everybody see the slides? Fantastic. So before I start, I wanted to say, oh, this is moving by itself. Okay. Before I start, I wanted to say that for me, it's very interesting, this idea that comes naturally to colleagues in Europe. These are like informal conversations I've had that naturally sort of see democratic erosion as led by the right. Because when I started to study this, when I first started to think about this, it was all about left-wing leaders. It was about Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and Rafael Corrales in Ecuador and Evo Morales in Bolivia and Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. And so for me, it was usually like the conversation I usually had to have was trying to explain sort of what was the opposite, right? I had to justify why would I think about somebody like Álvaro Uribe, who is very much on the right side of the spectrum, as an authoritarian or as a leader with authoritarian tendencies. So this is really interesting for me. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the conversation started with something that for some of you might probably not be new, but for others it might be sort of a good way to start thinking about this. Before I begin, I need to learn how to use my computer first. I want to talk a little bit about how I think about regime and policy preferences. And I did not invent this distinction. This comes from literature like Mainwaring and Perez Niña's books on regime and policy preferences. But just to give you an idea of how I always thought about this, I think about regime and policy preferences as two different dimensions. Your regime preferences refer to what regime do you like, right? Like, do you like democracies or do you like autocracies? And we can go on and on and on about leaders that, regardless of whether they're left or right, actually would rather live in an autocracy, regardless of which kind of ideology this autocracy is. And we can also go on and on and on about people who, regardless of their policy preferences, would rather live in a democracy, myself included. And then, of course, you have your policy preferences, and that would be sort of left and right. And left and right is very hard to define universally. In Latin America, for the longest time, your sort of up until probably the rise of Bolsonaro, your right-wing illiberal leaders were mostly security, iron fist kind of leaders. We're talking about Fujimori, we're talking about Álvaro Uribe, we're talking about people who came in with very sort of radical ideas on how to end usually political violence, right? Of course, the rise of Bolsonaro, and to a certain extent, Milei, if you want to think about it, has changed that and has kind of expanded this spectrum, and Nayib Bukele sits somewhere in between. Now, of course, you can have left-wing leaders with high preference for democracy. I consider Salvador Allende to be one of them. You can also have sort of right-wing leaders with high preference for democracy. Patricio Aylwin in Chile is also a good example of it. And then you can have your pick on the autocratic side of business, right? You can have Fidel Castro on the left, or you can have Efraín Ríos Montt on the right. Today, we see the same distribution, right? Gabriel Boric in Chile is left-wing, like he prefers left-wing policies, broadly speaking, but he also supports democracy, broadly speaking. Then you have Luis Lacalle Pou, who is a right-wing leader who was president of Uruguay up until recently, who also prefers democracy. And again, on the autocracy side, you can have your pick. You can have Nicolás Maduro, who is in the left-ish. And then you can have Nayib Bukele, who is on the right, and they both are more sort of autocratic leaders. Now, when we think about the pink tide, people usually think about authoritarian leaders, authoritarian left-wing leaders coming to power, but I want to say it was broader than that. Between the 2000s and 2010s, what we see across Latin America is the rise of left-wing leaders across the spectrum in Venezuela, Chile, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and in El Salvador, right? These are all sort of left-wing leaders in the more economic sense of the spectrum, rather than the social sense of the spectrum. But they were not alike. And there's plenty of works that compare them. And roughly, I think about them in two different groups. Before I go into the different groups, they were all come out about in a context of poor economic performance. We're talking hyperinflation, we're talking super high inequality, we're talking about high levels of poverty, so on and so forth. They also come in context of really poor governance. We're talking about not necessarily violence, because violence would usually create a different kind of populace, but really they came about in a context in which the basic service the state provides, be it access to justice, access to security, access to healthcare, education, some kind of job security or protection, so on and so forth, were failing across the board. And then incredibly deficient representation. So it's not the problem wasn't necessarily only that all of these things were happening, but also that the traditional sort of parties or the traditional leaders or the traditional sort of representatives were not doing their job. If you think about representation, one of the things that usually people who study political parties think about is the idea of vertical coordination, and that did not exist. All of these leaders, regardless, came in there with a promise of inclusion. And I understand inclusion in the sense that Kapichevsky, Levitsky, and Jasher define it, which means recognition, that is, recognize actors that were not recognized before as legitimate actors in society, access, that is, access to institutional channels to influence political decision-making, and resources, which of course talks about sort of the distribution of material, financial, and legal assets across groups, particularly groups that did not have access to them. All of these leaders promise inclusion. And to achieve these promises, they follow two different paths. So on the one hand, you have what I would call leaders with authoritarian tendencies or left-wing leaders with authoritarian tendencies. And on the other hand, you have your more democratic left-wing leaders. Your leaders with authoritarian tendencies use what Sam Handley has called transformative inclusion. And this transformative inclusion include a rapid change to rapid change and restructure of the state, right? In ways that enhance the powers of the executive and reduce the checks on the executive and extended the leader's time in office. Pretty much the idea behind these regimes was that you needed to reshape the entire state. And you needed to concentrate power on the executive so that the executive could do the transformations that he or she was called to do. Now, this group, for the most part, and this is also something Handling studies very deeply, achieves more rapid inclusion. In the countries in which these leaders came about, especially in the short term, what you see is a rapid reduction in poverty, rapid reduction in inequality. You see a huge mobilization of people, inclusion of people in the political arena, right? But at the same time, you also see patchy implementation of policies. The policies implemented were incomplete, to put it in a good way. So a great example of these are the misiones that Hugo Chavez created, right? And so Hugo Chavez deployed the resources of the state to create these short-term plans to address education inequality and healthcare inequality and housing inequality. But in doing so, he created only like band-aids, right? This also has to do with the electoral incentives behind these things. But in general, they were just patchy implementation of policies, usually in many of these cases fueled by the resource boom that we saw during the 2000s. And last but not least, all of these cases are marked with democratic erosion, and several of them are marked with democratic breakdown. Hugo Chavez effectively transformed Venezuela into an authoritarian regime. Today is one of the most authoritarian regimes in the world. Daniel Ortega transformed what was a very weak democracy, of course, into a fully authoritarian regime as well. Rafael Correa and Evo Morales, they both transformed their countries into competitive authoritarian regimes. And while I think democracy survived in Argentina, it was touch and go. Then you have your other left-wing leaders. We're talking about your democratic left-wing leaders that did not seek to stay in power beyond their second term, that did not seek to expand the powers of the executive beyond like what you would consider reasonable, that did not have plebiscitary measures, so on and so forth. These leaders, and I'm blanking Mauricio Funes because Mauricio Funes, we can talk about Mauricio Funes later. I think he was less successful in what he intended to achieve, and I think this is part because of El Salvador's context of high violence. But Mauricio Funes and the left and the MFLN in El Salvador, they were just less successful. In any case, what these leaders implemented is what Samlin has called Sam Handling has called technocratic incrementalism. This means piecemeal reform. So these leaders did not seek to expand the powers of the executive. They did not seek to reshape the state. Instead, what they sought was to reform the state within the existing checks and balances, without transforming democratic institutions altogether. And in doing so, they were, to a certain extent, less inclusive. Sort of outcomes, especially in the short term, suggest that indeed, sort of the change in Bolivia, the change we observe in Bolivia, in Venezuela, in Ecuador, is significantly faster and significantly far-reaching than the change we see in economic indicators and in inclusion indicators in Chile, in Brazil, or in Uruguay. But they also did a better job at creating long-standing policies that remain in place up until today. And of course, there is the fact that democracy survived all of these leaders. And in many of these cases, they left their countries more democratic than what they found. Now, we have seen recently what I am going to call here the new pink tide. If any Latin Americanist has problems with that, I'm happy to adopt a different name, but I'm going to call it a new pink tide. Because we have seen after the 2010s, what we see is the rise of right-wing leaders across the region. A lot of these presidents that I just discussed were replaced by democratic and undemocratic leaders on the right. So we have like a gap of, let's just say, about 10 years before the next kind of wave of left-wing leaders comes about, and that would be Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and of course now Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico. Luis Arce in Bolivia, Alberto Fernández in Argentina, Gustavo Petro in Colombia. We also have Pedro Castillo in Peru that I don't have here because Pedro Castillo's government was interrupted, and I don't feel very confident talking about sort of public policy during Castillo's government. And then you have Gabriel Boric, sorry for the age there, Gabriel Boric in Chile, and then Lula in Brazil again. Now, I split this group into three kind of buckets. Gabriel Boric and Lula da Silva are, in my view, sort of left-wing democratic leaders. They do not seek to reshape the state. They are willing to negotiate with other sides across the aisle to a certain extent. Lula is closer to left-wing to sort of authoritarian leaders. So there was, in the past recent elections in Venezuela, Lula tried to kind of negotiate with Maduro, and to a certain extent, I think that is a strategic position, though I'm not an international an IR expert, but I do think Lula in general is a democratic leader. Then I think you have in the center what I call leaders with some sort of discursive authoritarianism, but that haven't quite crossed red lines. And I would put there Luis Arce, Alberto Fernández, and Gustavo Petro. They all have sort of discursively, they all have engaged in highly polarizing, highly populistic, highly anti-liberal discourses in many ways. But at the same time, they have not gone up and tried to reform the courts or taken over oversight bodies or so on and so forth. And then you have Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico, who I think not only has a populistic, polarizing discourse, but went ahead and tried to reshape the state. He tried to undermine the checks on the executive. He tried to co-opt courts and oversight agencies, defund them when he was unable to co-opt them, and he has pretty much transformed the structure of democratic institutions in Mexico. These leaders, I believe, follow in a continuum across some of the things that I said before. To a certain extent, leaders like Andrés Manuel López Obrador tend to be more inclusive than leaders like Boric or Lula. And the reason is because when you reshape the state, to a certain extent, you're able to bring into the arena populations that cannot be channeled through traditional channels. To a certain extent, I also believe, and like data shows, AMLO has been successful at various economic indicators, and his voters recognize that. On the other hand, however, Mexico is at the brink of becoming a competitive authoritarian regime because AMLO has destroyed democratic institutions, right? Which is not true for Chile, which is not true for Brazil. And despite discursive, polarizing discourses in Colombia, Bolivia, and Argentina, I also don't think it's true, at least for these leaders in these countries. My fellow Colombians may disagree. I'll be happy to have a conversation about that. So, is there always a trade-off? We think about left-wing leaders, we think about sort of sometimes, or I don't think I think sometimes, there's we are presented with the government and with left-wing social justice, left-wing ideals as a trade-off between those ideals and democracy. So if you had gone to a public university in Latin America, like I did, many of your professors would have said, well, back in the early 2000s, many of your professors would have said that there is no way that we can have a fair democracy with this, with the current structure, right? Like that what you need to have is an Hugo Chavez that is willing to break things and transform them. And to a certain extent, that to achieve more inclusion is necessary to reshape democratic institutions. My take on this is that this is only true if we're thinking about inclusion in the short term. If we're willing to wait, if we're thinking about inclusion in the long term, I believe piecemeal reform within checks and balances provide better, and perhaps more importantly, more stable outcomes. Because, and I will conclude with this, whereas it is true that Hugo Chavez or Evo Morales may have achieved fastest inclusion, it is also true they did it without any kind of negotiation with their opponents. And in doing so, they risk that inclusion as soon as their opponents come to power. Whereas if you think about Ricardo Lagos or Michelle Bachelet or even Boric or even Lula, the inclusion they achieved it by negotiating with opponents. And to a certain extent, that is more likely to remain in place once these leaders are in office. And we have seen it throughout. We have seen it like, yes, Pete lost the elections, Bolsonaro governed for 4 years, and he wasn't able to entirely undo every single reform done during the Lula and Dilma Rousseff's government. Likewise, Chile and Uruguay have gone through a couple of right-wing presidents, and they have not been able to undo sort of the redistribution measures and the inclusion measures and reforms done during left-wing governments. And I think this is because painfully negotiated policies, painfully negotiated changes are significantly more stable over time than these very rapid, oftentimes filled with mineral booms or some kind of resource boom changes that we saw in the early 2000s in Latin America. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Laura. And particularly big thanks for highlighting the importance of the efficiency of policies next to commitment to values. I think it's very important. And now let me invite Armando, and I would like to ask you to speak about the geopolitical and foreign policy preferences of these actors, and also about the consequences of these preferences.
Thank you, Sol. Thank you, everybody. Well, after this amazing conference of Laura, I don't have too much to say. No, it's a joke. I have something to say. Well, let me share my screen because I think, okay, that's, yes. Everybody can see my presentation? It's okay?
Yes.
Fine. Okay. Well, I'm trying to select some ideas to stimulate the discussion. For me, it's the most important here. I'm going to refer something that Laura has been referred previously, but in my case, I'm going to put the focus in ideology, coincidence, but also in the geopolitical confluence between the extreme radical illiberal, but also anti-liberal. We sometimes forget that Cuba exists, and Cuba is a classical anti-liberal regime, and a more progressive populist left, illiberal left. So let me begin with where we are. Where is the place which we are looking these phenomena? I select the two images of two books of very prestigious Mexican institution, El Colegio de México, two of the collection of Historia Mínima, Minimal Studies, about the political right-wing forces in Latin America, the history, and the forces of the unions in Latin America. As you can see, the representation, the visual representation of all the right forces is a very ugly representation. No? It's a military man, very ugly, probably authoritarian, with the tooth is barking. So it is the representation of the right forces, not in a propaganda space, but also in a very serious, very professional academic space. The book, of course, is not reduced to this kind of comics, but it's very important that the author and the public house, the institution, select this image to the book. And the other side is a very traditional epic picture about the workers with flags. Anyway, so let me begin with this example, because I think that is a very concentrated example of the way in which we think left and right, not the difference between democratic and authoritarian left and right, but also right and left as supposed homogeneous political sphere. So I have some quotes about some reference in my presentation. You can have take the information, or we can share information after that. The first idea is that exists academic blind spot and ideological bias in the Western academy, in the general sense, and with historical roots from the beginning of the intellectual sphere, from the last year of the 19th century, but especially in the 20th century, in which the Western academy, North America, Europe, but also Latin America, show a clear, more sympathy and ideological bias with leftist ideas, movement, people, and governments that from the right movements, leadership, but also intellectual. I am not talking about the extreme radical and authoritarian left and right, but also the whole picture of each ideological position. It leads to overfocus on against the present, for example, the work, the analysis, and even the public position in reference to illiberal, but also authoritarian people for the extreme right, like Bolsonaro, Trump, Orban, but at the same time, is side by side with the underrepresentation of critical views about authoritarian ideas, practice, and of illiberal, but also anti-liberal left. Let me share with you a small history. We talked with Laura, with Esther, with Sol. I have been in several spaces, intellectual, but also academic, that is not the same space, in the last year, where the level of energy, the level of lobby that you can see to present ideas about the existence, as Laura said, of authoritarian left is very huge. But also at the same time, the acceptation, the normal acceptation that exists and is danger, authoritarian right is normal. And I'm not talking about extreme left propaganda space, but also liberal space in the global north. So the discussion of illiberalism, as Sol say, is over-focused to dedicate more attention to the right forces. And this produces analytical bias that affect the Latin American public space, the discussion, and also the articulation between academia, civil society, and politics to improve the possibility, for example, of trans-ideological solidarity between democratic left and radical and right and democratic right forces in the present of our continent, for example. As Laura say, I'm going to refer Laura several times because I think that having an amazing contextualization. We are talking not about universal context for all the time, for all the places. We are talking about specific regional context with contingent political development, specifically more in the post-Cold War Latin America. We have, of course, various different historical and also geopolitical configuration between authoritarian ideologies from the colonial times onto the Cold War, and also specific autocratic regime from right wing, from left wing, mostly in the right wing, or mostly in conservative sense in the 19th century against liberal, in the 20th century most in the classical right wings, with few experience, few cases of authoritarian left, that's Cuba. But in the post-Cold War Latin America, we have a reality, a geopolitical reality. We have the three close autocratic regime belong to the revolutionary left. Nor every regime, they are not from the extreme right regime. We have three close autocratic regime, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, that belong to the revolutionary left. They are geopolitically articulate each other, and also with another autocratic global power like China, Russia, but are supported by consolidated networks of propaganda very close, for example, to Latin America, but also global North academia. At the same time, the self-defined, we must discuss even this concept of progressive, because have been monopolized by a sense of left. I see the progressive is more open, but anyway, the self-defined progressive government, parties, social movement, and other actors, academia, media, NGOs, Mango, as Esther said, come to power democratically, yes, but convert in ideological issues, but also political network with authoritarian left. For example, Grupo de Puebla, Foro de Sao Paulo, are places which the authoritarian left and the democratic left have convergence, share ideas, share articulate agenda, anyway. Let me dedicate 2 or 3 minutes to explain this difference, because we are talking all the time in the last 5 years about illiberalism, but we forget that exists anti-liberalism. And the anti-liberalism in Latin America exists as a very concrete, very specific regime, that is Cuba, with huge influence in the neighborhood, mostly in Nicaragua and Venezuela, that began as illiberalist leadership, but have been converted to autocratic anti-liberal regime. But this difference is very important to understand, the point of convergence, but also the difference between these two phenomena. I select 3 levels or 3 issues to analyze, for example, very quickly. We have the revolutionary anti-liberalists from the 20th century that have a full rejection to liberal order, that their political model is a totalitarian one-party regime, and their global projection in historical sense was anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, understand as anti-Americanism, and the pro-Soviet or East Bloc alignment. This is the revolutionary anti-liberalism of the 20th century, in which Cuba case is one survival, but also Nicaragua and Venezuela are new beginners in this path. We have at the same time the illiberal government, the liberal leadership that are not in all the cases regime, because in several cases they remain in the border of democracy sometimes, but they have different approachment to the issues of liberal order. It's adaptative and selective rejection or treatment with the liberal order, not full rejection. The political model is mostly illiberal democracy, liberal government, but also hybrid regime in some case. And the global projection is, the idea of South-South cooperation, the South-East cooperation, and the multilateralism, the multipolaralism, this is not multilateralism, multipolaralism, that is very close to a discourse and the phenomenon that has been researched recently, that is the civilizational discourse with roots in China, Russia, and other places. Well, this is, of course, a very synthetic and formal representation of the difference between these two traditions inside, close at the same time in some space and ideas. We have some geopolitical convergence, and this is maybe the place, the space to discuss, for example, even with Laura, about where we can put to Lula or to Petro in some sense, because yes, in internal politics, the illiberal, not anti-liberal, illiberal populist, so self-named progressive left, I'm not talking about Boric. Boric is classical for me, is very clear democratic left in internal and foreign policy, at least until the moment. But in geopolitical, in foreign policy issues, you can see several, several paths, several attitudes that put more together to the extreme anti-liberal left and to this progressive, illiberal, populist left. Progressive liberal leadership and government, for example, increasingly aligned in global issues with Bolivarian autocratic regime agenda, normalizing the later, for example, after the Venezuela crisis of last year. Of course, Cuba is normalizing all the time. For example, Luis Ignacio da Silva Lula, the foreign policy, in the hand of in some case, in the hand of extreme left of the Partido de los Trabajadores, Worker Party, have been normalizing the crisis, the dictatorship, the repression in Cuba, but all the times, supporting with financial aid, supporting in foreign international space. Anyway, I select three lines to the discussion. First, the shared discourses, action, and resource. The idea of anti-imperialism present like Occidentalists, you know this discussion in the theory and history recently. The global South rhetoric, I have wrote an article for Foreign Affairs Latin America about the South globalism, like an ideology that tried to mobilize the idea of global South. The sexist in fact to liberal institution, and we can see, for example, most, I don't know if most, but an important group of leadership, also intellectual and organization in the illiberal left, trying to improve the CELAC, but the CELAC have been, for example, with Honduras government in the hands of government that trying to attack the other institution, the American state organization, for example, that tried to defend the government of Maduro in Venezuela. That is a very classical coup d'etat with military repression. The Grupo de Puebla, the Puebla group that have been found in Mexico, for example, they are together people from the Socialist Party in Latin America, but also in Europe, Zapatero, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, Samper from Colombia, at the same time that they are with the people of Cuba and Venezuela. For more recently, Venezuela and Cuba have been, the Cuban foreign minister have been in the meeting of Grupo de Puebla, the Venezuela Council foreign minister, anyway. At the same time, we have more concrete, more specific and clear autocratic cooperation in the two ways of autocratic cooperation, as diffusion, but also as promotion of autocratic relationship. For example, between Mexico and Cuba in the recent year have been increased a lot the energy supplies to Cuba, the financial subsidies to Cuba, and in the other side, the improvement of propaganda training and political influence in Mexico, in a moment in which, as Laura said, Mexico has been in a change, and I think that is not changing, but it has been the change in the main institution and process from the flower democracy, illiberal democracy, to an authoritarian hybrid regime. And one of the most traceable and most detectable ideas of convergence in foreign policy position, for example, the abstention on United Nations voting about Russian invasion of Ukraine, of Venezuela human rights, to huge crises that affect democracy and human rights, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and in Venezuela human rights crisis after the election of the July 28th of the last year. The rejection of selective condemn to authoritarian crackdown. For example, you can see Mexico, but also Colombia government, but also Brazil, less, but more clear, Mexico and Colombia, very, very vocal, very, very quickly, very fast to condemn not only El Salvador, but at the same time, for example, even less authoritarian center-right government like Ecuador, condemn this government, at the same time, absolutely silence or some kind of evasive maneuver to condemn Venezuela, and at the same time, nothing to say about Cuba that is not illiberal, but also anti-liberal regime with a huge on the space, on the time influence in this illiberal left. And the last but not less important, the delegitimation of regional liberal institutions like Organization of American States, with several problems, but the Organization of American States have an institution, norm, values, la Carta Interamericana, Inter-American Chart, that it was approved in the beginning of the 21st century, that trying to consolidate the defense of liberal democracy in the region with a very important, for example, apparatus, very important institutionality to the defense of human rights against different government, left, right, left wing, right wing. So it's very clear that Mexico, Colombia, but also government have been trying to delegitimize all the time the attitude of the Secretary General of OAS or the himself existence of this situation. So my last point is that we have a Latin American alignment, not clear in all the fair, but in some points, specifically, and especially in the foreign policy, between the illiberal governments, not only authoritarian regime, but illiberal government and the anti-liberal regime. It's conducive to the erosion of illiberal regional norm, weakening the Organization of American States, for example, and the Inter-American, for me, is even so or more important, Inter-American human rights system, and trying to together rise to empower alternative forum without democratic safeguard, like CELAC, for example. It conduces in the global realms, in the global affair, to reinforce the objectives and the leverage in the region of revisionist autocratic region, actor, for example, Russia and China. And it have an influence because the influence of this autocratic global regime in autocratic cooperation with several Latin American anti-liberal regime, but also like in Mexico, illiberal government have been increased in the last time. And I only add thank you to everybody.
Thank you very much. And particular thanks for mentioning what you call analytical asymmetry, that is the different treatment of left-wing and right-wing illiberalism and authoritarianism in academia. I think that justifies partly this seminar. Now, let me draw again attention of the audience that you can pose questions and comments in the function of Zoom below the screens. And let me turn now to something seemingly completely different, but hopefully there will be some continuity. So I will ask Esther to speak about West European developments, German developments, hopefully still mentioning this tension that seems to exist between inclusivity or inclusion and liberal rights.
Can you see it? Okay, and full screen? Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you very much for having me here, and I'm trying to connect a little bit, especially to what Armando said. My current research project is about cancel culture and cancel culture debates in Germany, and with a specific focus on academia. So that's what I am doing, but the paper I am presenting is not a full paper, not an empirical paper. Hopefully in half a year or in a year I can present also empirical results, but at this moment I'm trying to stir up the debate a bit, or also invite you for discussion, and I will draw from some theoretical insights and also from the texts that theoreticians of these trends develop, and also from my interviews, and I hope for a lively discussion afterwards. So basically, let me connect it immediately to Armando's talk. I very much liked what he said, especially about this analytical asymmetry, but Zsolt was also highlighting, but also this Western academia's ideological sympathy with leftist movements. And I believe this is part of the reasons of why certain things are not analyzed, but also why certain things are not seen as problems because of own value commitments and also their own understandings of how academia should work, how academia should be politicized. When I come originally from the research on the right wing and anti-gender research, so how the right wing politicizes what they call gender ideology, and I see among my colleagues how sophisticated methods they have to see and analyze the violence coming out of these movements, whereas there are almost no analysis or even not even seen as a problem that there is also violence and threats and bullying on the progressive side in the name of progressive causes. And I believe this asymmetry needs to be addressed both analytically and politically. So what I am dealing with are actually these very problematic concepts, and I am aware that these are problematic because often they sound like battle cries by conservatives and the far right to delegitimize certain social justice causes altogether, like equality between men and women or anti-racism. That's not what I want to say. I don't think that all recognition issues are bad and we should go back to good old days when everybody knew their place. However, there are some developments in the recent years of which there are not only conservative or far-right critics, but also liberal and Marxist critics. And I think we could draw from that to assess this phenomena. And as I said, it is necessary both from political and analytical point of view. And why I stress this, because it is very difficult to make the difference, also because academics themselves are active in the political field, also because many of the debates are happening actually in academia. And let me introduce you to this concept that Armando was already making a spoiler to, developed by Alex Hochuli in this prestigious political theory journal called X. I really like this term mango because it. Okay, so it's we can see very clearly that these are not unimportant actors and that they are somehow connected, but they are not political parties, but they influence very much public discourse and they influence each other, and also activism influences academia, academic concepts go somehow into activism and in the media, and all they influence politics. So, and this makes it all the more difficult to separate analytical and political points of view in this field. What I would like to do is, without aiming at being complete, just bring in some issues which might have something to do with illiberalism or illiberal trends, or what Jolt mentioned in the beginning, that it is totally possible to combine leftist economic or social positions with total rejection of individual freedoms and pluralism. I think it's a good definition to start with. And first I say some elements of the contents, how social justice activism and how left have changed. And then some to the form and to their idea of politics and theory of change, to then in the end say some things to what extent we can call it illiberal left. So, okay, why is the term illiberal better than anti-liberal? We all know that the left has had a very long tradition of critiques towards liberalism, like liberalism being a handmaiden of capitalism, or in a more or in a less radical sense that the idea of freedom of liberalism is very narrow, and social democratic or leftist economic policies and social policies make more freedom for more people, or critique of the imperialism of US hegemony, of Western dominance. These all come from the left, so there's nothing new here. However, I think there have been a lot of changes in the past years. We could see it very clearly as for the contents, especially in the fields of gender, race, and migration. But the logic of the politicization was applied also to other fields, like how about COVID-19 measures, how about the war in Ukraine or the Israel-Palestine conflict is being spoken about, or how it is discursively framed, and how the positions are spread or identified, follows the same logic. When I ask the people I am interviewing, or in the texts which make some references to the changes within the left, they typically make out two junctures or two turning points for Europe. One is the refugee crisis of 10 years ago, and the other is the changes within LGBT activism, to basically turning to the T. After the same-sex marriage was legalized in the UK, after the US Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage there, basically the trans issues became more important, and then this Tumblr trend of the non-binary gender identities spilled out in the real world. And for me, this is a very paradigmatic example how fast actually these developments are, something that 17 years ago nobody has heard of, and now even registering for such a conference, you are asked to identify your gender. So meaning that the debates, or the term gender is now meaning gender identity, and you need my speech act to say if I am a woman, a man, or something else. You cannot read it on my name, you cannot read it on my face. This is an extremely quick and extremely radical change, but many of those things relating to the changes within anti-racism, within trans activism or LGBT activism, they all have obviously theoretical foremothers, forefathers, which are much older than these political changes in the last years. Very often those who follow these causes say that it's just a continuity of former causes, this is just about anti-discrimination, it's about expansion of human rights, while the change is much more radical, with a post-structuralist understanding of power, of identities, and of discursive politics. Also, they use the same concepts, but actually the meanings of those concepts have been very much extended. I would like to quote here Haslam, who coined the term concept creep actually 9 years ago. And back then he said that, and he discovered how certain psychological concepts like harm, abuse, trauma have been extended. I think it's obvious by now that he was right with that, but I believe that it is not only to these psychological concepts in the public sphere, but also like violence, hate, genocide, racism, transphobia. These terms are used now to much broader things than they used to be used to. And also there is this tendency of connecting of policy claims with identities, meaning if you oppose a certain policy claim, then you are very quickly accused of attacking a certain group, a certain identity, the existence of or the life of a certain people. I believe that these are very serious changes to former and more usual anti-liberal claims by the left. And as for the form, I don't have much time, so I just very briefly some of those things. And I am sure that those who are here from Europe, it's not the first time that they see such a list or hear such things. There has already been a lot of literature actually in the last year, so it's not me inventing these things. Basically, this new type of leftism, and I'm somehow it's very difficult to call it woke or whatever, but some new sort of leftism has a certain understanding of Gramsci and a certain interpretation of how to build hegemony, meaning creating a common sense and saying that what we are saying, it should be the only possible and imaginable way. And it is being done also through this friend and foe approach. It is, and probably I will make the German audience angry at this point. It is very deafening in the German context how strong it is all the time used. If you are not supporting this idea, then you are with the AfD, then you are with the Nazis. It's very, very very strong discourse and very small differences actually from the I don't know even if it's mainstream, but at least this comme il faut left can get this label. And I believe this is a discursive strategy to build hegemony. It is pursued with a certain dogmatism, and it's immunized against critics. So if you have something against us, it's already a proof that we are right. If you say that this or that is not racist, then you prove that you don't understand racism, hence you are a racist. I'm a bit exaggerating, but not too much. Then there is this very also very much inflation of moral arguments and moralization, and with that it's not meant that moral arguments have no place in politics. I wouldn't say that of course, but there is moralization is very much used as a weapon in the political fight, and because it is a very strong emotional blackmailing, it leads to polarization. So people can follow, or people can say, actually, I'm also a good person and I'm on the right side of history. Or you say, oh, come on, don't do that with me. Then it just go away from me. But it also has a class aspect, both in Marxian and in Bourdieusian sense, that it serves certain elite interests or economic interests, but also it is a habitus thing to certain views are used to distinguish themselves from the lower classes who don't speak the right language, who don't speak the right catalog of values. The politics of positionality, which is a very important corrective, I believe, of feminist and post-colonial scholars, is in the recent years very often misused to delegitimize dissenters on the basis of their identities. So me as a cis white woman, how do I dare to speak about certain issues? What can I know, and why don't I give the floor to others, as if those issues wouldn't concern me or wouldn't concern society or at large. And I already made reference to that the stakes are made so high. If you are not with us, then you are with the right wing, or the terms are so much expanded that basically every opposition to the claims comes or is interpreted as violence. Hence, go against it is presented as self-defense. And there is not only in social media, but also in academia, also in political parties and social movements, a very threatening and intimidating a practice of that people are excluded if they do not conform or do not subscribe to certain ideas. I cannot describe it at this point very closely and very solidly, but I believe these are phenomena that deserve a critical scrutiny also from democratic point of view. So my point here is that it seems that culture war is not just something what the right wing is doing. I think it is doing it very well and very efficiently, especially in my own country, Hungary. But we need to look at it in a relational approach, and how those polarization entrepreneurs are fueling it, and some of them are on the left. My last slide is this, and you can read more about it also in the paper I wrote about illiberal left, that I believe that these 3 points are the key characteristics for calling something not only anti-liberal left, not only a left critical of liberalism, but illiberal, meaning rejecting individual freedoms and pluralism, and rejecting the liberal democratic order, which shouldn't necessarily be in the left. One is anti-pluralism, second is anti-intellectualism, and the third is authoritarianism. So basically, at least in social psychological sense, this conformity and expectation of conformity and penalization of rule breakers, as Zsolt Enyedi writes about it. Actually, Zsolt's paper about the different illiberalisms gives a very good catalog of how to classify, and gives also arguments why actually we can classify as illiberal these practices. And to conclude also with what Armando writes in his recent paper, that illiberalism is not a phenomenon exclusive to one ideology, but a political strategy that can manifest on both the right and the left. And I think it is crucial to call it as a political strategy, so it's not just an ideology, it's not just a discourse or some crazy activists, of which there have always been, and there will always be. So I believe this is something to take seriously, and it's basically that's how I would like to finish, to call for more research and more reflection in the field, and to develop analytical tools and strategies if we care for liberal democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was excellent. I introduced your presentation as one being focused on Western Europe, but after listening to what you said, I think it's pretty global what you find. It's partly because of globalization, this discourse is spread. So perhaps one starting point for the discussion could be actually to think whether the patterns you have found, you have described, exist in Latin America, and whether they apply to Latin American discourses. But I have a couple of other questions. So perhaps I would just go through my laundry list, the comments that I wrote down while listening to you, and then open up the discussion. You can react to each other, and then after we finish with this round, we will also look into the questions posed by the audience. So the one question I already mentioned, so it will be basically to Armando and Laura, whether you find the characteristics described by Esther adequate for capturing illiberal left in Latin America. Then I have some more specific questions. The first question maybe concerns most Laura, but others can also chime in. And this is, when can we be sure that the actor we are talking about is a leftist? And the country and the leader that made me most think about that label was Nicaragua and Ortega. And I perfectly understand that the origin of his party and of himself can be placed on the left. I'm a little bit unsure whether the regime at the moment can be described as a left-wing one. Then, still probing into what makes someone a leftist, I was a little bit wondering about the personal lifestyle of some of these leaders. Laura mentioned that inclusion was a major goal and motivation for these movements. So I'm just wondering whether, Maduro, Correa, Morales, AMLO in Mexico, and so on, to what extent, since you probably know much more about their lifestyle than I do, to what extent you can argue that they are actually socialist politicians, in the sense that they genuinely believe in egalitarian values and they live their life accordingly. The third question, still about the character, ideological character of these actors, is how do they think about some fundamental concepts of politics like religion and nation? Are they at war with these concepts? Do they embrace them? Do they stay away from debates around these major values and concepts, or actually they have their own specific take on them? Then I was a little bit wondering about the new left versus old left dichotomy that emerged in some of these presentations. There is one particular concept that I would like to hear about, and this is neoliberalism, in the sense that in my experience, neoliberalism is public enemy number one. That is probably true for the old left and for the new left. Do they mean the same thing under this label of neoliberalism? Is it so that some are more interested in criticizing neoliberalism than others, and so on? Finally, when I was listening to Esther's comments on positionality as a weapon used in politics, I wondered, isn't this a self-limiting weapon? After all, you may want to support LGBTQI cause even if you are not member of the community. So cannot be turned against you. I vaguely remember quite many strong activists on the trans issue who were not themselves trans. And, in those cases, this positionality question was not really put on the table. So I wonder how, this weapon can be used in any circumstance. And finally, a question that maybe Armando knows most about, and this is geopolitical friendships. I understand that, let's say, leaders of Cuba support Vladimir Putin because of the old Russian or Soviet-Cuban relations. But are there examples where radical left-wing illiberal leaders support right-wing dictators, explicitly right-wing dictators, or explicitly conservative regimes? Again, I don't know too much about it, but I vaguely remember that Iran also receives quite a lot of support from these actors. So I wonder whether in these cases, do the leftist politicians not ask themselves the question, shall I be on the side of this religious fundamentalist leader? Or is it the case that everything can be explained by anti-Americanism? In which case, maybe multipolarism that you mentioned may be simply a synonym for anti-Americanism. So sorry for the many questions. Please answer the ones you found most relevant for you. Who would like to start?
I can start. So thank you so much for the questions. I'm going to start with a question about sort of, do we see the characteristics that Esther's described in Latin America? And I think Armando may correct me. My sense is that we do see them, but we do see them at a sort of an academic elite level. We don't see them as a broader conversation, right? At least not extensively. Maybe in countries like Brazil, where Bolsonaro was like such a, but my sense is that the left or the right in Latin America, broadly speaking, is defined by other cleavages, either economic cleavages or security cleavages, mostly, right? That would be my broader sense. I do see it a lot in the United States. There were a lot of likes about like ding, 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 this, we do see it a lot in the United States. I think, and I'm not saying it doesn't exist, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, I just don't think it happens. I don't think it's popularized. I don't think it's what candidates discuss on TV at night or in Twitter. Like, I think the conversation is a different one. Okay, so I think thinking about the sort of these leftist actors, can we sure that they're leftist? And I'm gonna tie that one with the question about the personal lifestyle. My sense about leaders like Hugo Chavez, Evo Morales, Rafael Correa, to a certain extent, although I do think Ortega is more authoritarian than the former, but like to a certain extent, is that for them, eventually the leftist project is a personalistic project. Like populism is is such a part of their political project that like the Manichaean view of the world shapes not around ideology, but around who is with them and who is against them. And that changes over time, right? So I would argue that when Ortega came to power, he came with very much left-wing promises. But of course, today he is against, like major social reform. Like the protest of 2018 was because he wanted to cut down the budget for pensions. Like I think, and this is a matter of survival in power. Like at some point, it becomes a matter of survival in power rather than like a particular project. I don't think that that's how these leaders. I mean, I'll phrase it this way. I want to give them the benefit of the doubt. So I think that it's not necessarily true that these leaders start thinking, I'm coming to power to stay in power forever and ever. I think they come with these very radical projects, and then the only way for them to implement them in the way they want it, in their populistic view of the world, is by breaking democracy altogether, right? So I think that's true. For most of these leaders, I want to say there's a couple of exceptions. I think, for instance, the Uruguayan left has a very simple lifestyle in many ways, but then Uruguay is kind of an exception across the board in many ways. I think neoliberalism is both enemy number one, but also a catchphrase. Is like everything and anything is neoliberal. Like if you live in Colombia, everything and anything is neoliberal, right? Like, and I would argue that some of that is true. Yes, it is true. Like neoliberal reform changed, for instance, pensions and how we think about pensions. And we can have a conversation whether that was good or bad or whatever, whether it needs to be changed. But I think discursively is like the boogeyman, right? Just because people don't like it, but it's not necessarily always about sort of neoliberalism. And I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of how we think about religion and nation, because I think Latin America is very particular about that, especially religion, in terms. So I think for countries that are majoritarily Catholic, where evangelical churches have not made a lot of inroads, religion is an interesting one because Latin America is the daughter of the liberation theology. Like Catholics are conceived and thought of as left wing, right? Like traditionally so, right? And then you come the 80s, sort of the 90s, and then you have the hierarchy of the church being more conservative, but then you have like this kind of mesh of liberal theology traditions, and so these things start to work in different ways across the board, right? So in Nicaragua, sort of the church was on board with Ortega originally, mostly the hierarchy of the church, because they believed that they were against abortion and Ortega promised very harsh laws against abortion. But then, of course, as the regime became more repressive, today the regime is pretty much repressing Catholic priests who are trying to protect opponents, right? So I think this is a very interesting relationship, mostly in countries where evangelicals have not made a lot of inroads. I think the evangelical church changes and evangelical mobilization, political mobilization changes this a bit. And nationalism, I'll let Armando probably has a better idea of this, but I also think nationalism, because immigration, I mean, unless you're thinking about Venezuelan immigration, but because immigration is not such a big issue across the board, like nationalism is just not, it's not like I have not seen the first right or left-wing leader saying we are because Colombians is for Colombians. Like that's not something you hear. And I think this has to do with the fact that immigration is not such a salient issue in general. I mean, it might be locally. So if you go to certain cities in Colombia where you have a lot of Venezuelan migrants, it might be salient. But I think because of the way Venezuela plays geopolitically in Latin America, immigration in Venezuelan immigration plays differently geopolitically too. Right, and so right-wing leaders are going to be all about receiving immigrants and so on and so forth. Like, so I think it just plays different.
Thank you, Armando.
Well, it's a lot of questions. Sorry, because someone is tearing down a wall near here. It's not the Berlin Wall; it's another wall. I don't know, but I have a few ideas about your question. First, it's very interesting the dialectic between inclusion and exclusion. Because, yes, I think that in the rhetoric mostly, but in some moments and some places, even in material sense, for example, the level of the prices of oil allowed to Chavez to spend a lot of money, yes, in impractical with corruption, but he spent a lot of money to improve the quality of life of the people in Venezuela in the first year. Also in Cuba, when I born, also in Cuba. But the problem is that I'm not so sure that we can divide, a moment of inclusion and a politic of exclusion, because both go hand to hand. At the same time that all the illiberal leadership, but also, especially the more radical, but also the anti-liberal regime like Castro, develop a huge social spend and develop a politic of improve the level of life, the quality of life of the poor people. At the same time, they are making politic of exclusion, even with these own people based in one's criteria, loyalty. So in Venezuela, but also in Cuba, but also in Nicaragua, but also in the East regime, yes, the socialist or the populist state spend money with the poor people, with the worker class, with the peasant, but at the same time repress this worker class, this peasant. So I think that we should discuss more with more details the dialectic between inclusion with exclusion, not only in different class, but also inside the worker class that is the pretext or the objective of the socialist worker. Another important thing, the dichotomy between old and new left. I see that the problem, maybe Laura will discuss some idea about this, I don't know, is that in Latin America, it's not so clear by at least three different reasons. We don't have a Berlin Wall experience. We have the neoliberal experience. We have continuity. We have, at the same time, the implementation of neoliberal politics that restricts citizenship in social sphere, but we have the transition to democracy at the same time. This is the context of Latin America. It's not the context of East Europe, where, yes, the neoliberal politics go hand to hand with an improvement in the level of life of the people in the East at the same time, and with the recovery of the discovery of democracy. But in Latin America, we have another issue. It's more clear. We have discursive bridges between the old radical left and the new left. For example, neoliberalism is a discursive bridges. It's a concept that works as a discursive bridge between both. We have organizational bridge between both. For example, in the 1990, in the moment in which in Hungary, in Poland, in Czech, the system is falling, you know who is creating Foro de Sao Paulo? Fidel Castro with the Communist Party, a Leninist party, and Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva with a new left party. So I think that we should put attention on this one, because the Foro de Sao Paulo is the most important organization in Latin America in the left, put together to all Leninists, to all Stalinists, and to new progressive and new intermediate populists, like Laura described. So the founder of this strange animal are Lula and Fidel. It's something should say to us about this capacity. And in this year, for example, it was an effort in East Europe to establish contact from the people of Solidarity. And I know, for example, Lech Walesa was to have a meeting with Lula. And was Lula who said, we don't know nothing to do with you. So I think, yes, it was a meeting. I know the people who was in this meeting, for example. I think that we should take care when we consider the difference at the same time that we take care when we consider the similarities between new and old left in Latin America. Of course, I think that exists true new left, as for example, Boric in Chile, another one, but also because it's not only new in politics, but also for me more important in values. For example, the relationship with social diversity, with the consumer, for example, of marijuana. I don't know. The all left is very, very conservative with the drugs, very, and it's very homophobic, for example. And the last, for example, two more things very quickly. First, the dialectic of inclusion and exclusion is manipulated with the very experimented anti-liberal left. For example, the Cuban regime have approved in 2019 a new constitution that is more Soviet in the political control sense, because established in the old constitution was more still, but established clearly that the Communist Party is not only the vanguard of the political system, but also of the society and the nation. It's more Soviet. At the same time, the constitution talk about participation, deliberation, gender rights, and LGBT. And they approve a new family code that is almost Sweden code. So at the same time, they are not Ortega. They are approving a more Soviet constitution in the nucleus of power, and they approve a lot of things that are very important because have a power of seduction, for example, to the intellectual, to the European Union that is funding Cuban state. So yes, we have, and when you talk, for example, with European diplomats or even intellectuals, say, but you have a very progressive family code. You have the right to the same sex marriage. Yes, at the same time, we have the activists pro-LGBT and the feminist activists in jail by the Communist Party.
Yeah,
We can select this
contradiction.
Yeah,
Yes.
but very planified contradiction to have influence. And the last one, the relation between Cuba and Russia is in both dimensions of the autocratic cooperation. I'm going to publish something in the next month about it. In the pragmatic dimension, yes, supporting security, supporting military, not only from Russia to Cuba. I don't know if you know, but Cuba is the country with more troops in the Ukrainian war after North Korea. There exist 10,000 Cuban mercenaries in Russia. The Cuban state say, we don't know nothing. You don't know nothing about 10,000 mercenaries that flow to Cuba, to Russia. 10,000 mercenaries. It's very sad. Young people that are dying there for money, to escape to Cuba. And at the same time, there is an ideological common ground. The anti-Americanist, as you say, the anti-liberalist, there is the possibility that there is the same that explain that with Iran, that is theological conservative regime, but also, I'm going to finish with that, not only with Iran to Russia. Recently, the last year, I have an experience in Hungary. I was to teach a conference, we talk about this, and when I was to Hungary, the conference was canceled because the people of the foreign office don't like that someone that was an intellectual criticized the Cuban regime was there. So the Orban regime, that is conservative and reactionary in no sense, is very close to the Cuban regime. What have they in common? They are both illiberal, but in some sense anti-liberal.
That's an amazing fact. Esther?
I don't know if we have questions from the audience. I don't want to.
We have, and actually maybe you are the best position to answer them.
Okay.
Because some of the questions refer to the progressive themes you have enlisted.
Okay.
And one of the questions is whether it's possible to organize an international alliance around these topics, just like there is far-right international. So whether there is some sort of international cooperation around these topics is possible, is developing or not. And then the second question is also related, and maybe we could close with this question the entire webinar, and this is whether you see any difference in how the illiberal right and the liberal left behaves in power. How do they affect democracy? Is there a difference? So Esther, the floor is yours, and then very shortly I will give back the floor to Armando and Laura, but indeed very shortly because we are running out of time.
Okay, first I would like to go back a bit to your question
Sure.
actually originally. First to these concepts of religion and nation, if they have a place in illiberal left in Europe. As for religion, I think there is this a very difficult relation to Islam, and it's very, I don't have a good language to how to address it, but at least this new left, I will come back to that later, has a very cautious relation to Islam so as not to stigmatize a complete religion or a complete nations. However, it makes it very difficult to address some cultural differences or what to do if they do not respect women's rights or gays' rights. And so there is some practices are somehow culturalized or somehow excused as cultural inherent to Islam, in my perception, and it's very difficult to talk about them. But also the other part is there are a lot of analyses which analyze actually this woke left, I would say now, as a new religion, that it's ersatz, it's something that we have, these big meaning-making ideologies are not there, neither political ideologies nor religious, and this forms a new coherent something. And to the term of nation, obviously these are very suspicious of the concept of nation, but they are anti-imperialistic and anti-West, and also a bit self-hating West and anti-US. But I honestly believe post-colonial scholarship and global South rhetoric gave us a lot, actually, to understand global relations. However, this has also somehow become rigidified in my understanding, and it has become like a ready toolkit to analyze things very rigidly, and it's also somehow it is also exported to other nations like East Central Europe, and if you do not take it up as the most modern, best way of analyzing things, then you are backward. So actually it follows a bit this imperialist knowledge production logic that it wants to expose. This is my understanding. Neoliberalism is a tricky thing, obviously, and also this old left, new left thing. I'm struggling with you. I normally I use the term woke, but I know that it is an activist term and also as a battle cry term, so it's very difficult to say. But there was the old left, then came the neoliberal new left, as we all know, with Blair and Schröder and all the stuff. And this now is actually wanting to go back partly, so that it's also more anti-capitalistic and has more welfare promises, in my understanding, or wanting to connect recognition issues with redistribution issues better than it was. And actually the Marxist critiques of this woke left come back to the neoliberalism term, meaning that the woke is perfectly compatible with this neoliberal zeitgeist, with this individualistic, consumerist logic that you have to put up your identities from small pieces, or that you cannot look for structural change, you can look for change only on a very micro level. You can police your neighbor or your sparring partner on social media, but you cannot achieve like global justice somehow. But I don't know, but yeah, it's an interesting thing. And the last point to positioning, I agree with you completely. It's self-defeating, and it's also alienating many people who would actually be allies. And it's very funny because the right wing is also has learned this language. And I remember when in Hungary a new president was elected some years ago, Katalin Novák, the first female president. But she was very, very loyal to Orbán with his Fidesz earrings at election night. And so basically the opposition was criticizing her that, oh no, she will be the president. She will just sign everything what the Fidesz-dominated parliament adopts. And what was the response? You are sexist. Actually, you don't believe that a woman can make autonomous decisions. So basically, this positionality fetish of the left was used against them. I believe it's often you don't have. It's not enough to have the right identity. You also have to have the right opinion. So if a trans person or a black person formulate some critique, which happens obviously, about certain tendencies in this woke left, then it is called, you are a self-hating black, a self-hating trans, so you are not defending the right cause. So actually, I think it is rather a justification than a meaningful tool, but it can backfire, and it leads to a very toxic practice. As for the progressive themes, if there is something like a far-right international, a progressive international that exists. There are lobby organizations, parties, NGOs, thematic-wise, like transgender lobby groups uniting on EU level, or ILGA Europe, or LGBT issues, or feminist issues, or all sorts of things. But I am unaware, probably it just doesn't come to my mind if there are broader alliances, but definitely they try to organize themselves. But as it's very different from the Latin American perspective, in the sense that you were talking about leaders and who are leading countries, and I am talking about the Mango, which has a very different access to power. So it's difficult to see at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Due to the fact that we had a somewhat incompetent and definitely not illiberal leadership, we ran out of time. So I have only maybe 1 minute left. If Armando or Laura would like to say something using this 1 minute, then please go ahead.
No, nothing. Thank you for inviting us. I think these spaces are incredibly important, not only in terms of discussing what is and what is not illiberal, but also because I think they make us frame better how do we protect democracy, regardless of where the threat is coming from.
I also add that we should defend the pluralist not only by a reality himself, but as a value of the political and social world. And at the same time, we should reject any normative ex-ante self-assigned position of superiority, moral superiority in any political position.
Thank you. So basically, I think we are advocating open-mindedness here. So let me thank Esther, Laura, Armando for this fantastic talks and then the conversation. The audience who stayed with us, I would like to encourage everyone to follow our social media channels. And finally, I would like to thank Zsuzsanna Vég, who helped us organizing this event. Please just have a great day and be open-minded. Goodbye.